the decibel range. Yeah, it'll be just like a live lecture that your teacher records and responds to the one person who decided to tune into the Zoom call. So let's go ahead. And I guess briefly we can cover the introduction. So kind of funnily, we're going to be starting at the bottom of the page where it says victory and defeat. So Ark McVeigh writes, if we want to win, no matter how moderate or militant we are, we have to understand how movements have succeeded in the past. Gene Sharp has written extensively on how to end dictatorships, the principles of which apply to abolishing any entrenched and exploitative system of power. In his book, From Dictatorship to Democracy, he argues when one wants to bring down a dictatorship most effectively, and with the least cost, then one has four immediate tasks. Strengthen the oppressed population themselves in their determination, self-confidence, and resistance skills. Strengthen the independent social groups and institutions of the oppressed people. Create a powerful internal resistance force, and develop a wise, grand strategic plan for liberation and implement it skillfully. He concludes, against a strong, self-reliant force, given wise strategy, disciplined and courageous action, genuine strength, the dictatorship will eventually crumble. Any thoughts, any ideas on that? Personally, I kind of critique the idea of developing wise, grand strategic plans until you've, I don't know, effectively organized an entire community. It's kind of, but Gene Sharp isn't necessarily thinking about bottom-up revolution in the way that we are. Interstitial, prefigurative revolution for any FBI agents watching. Yeah, it should be molded by the means you have available to you, as Good Moose says. Yeah, I think that strategy a lot of the time is most useful when you're applying it to specific problems instead of developing like wide grand strategies, just because so much is unknown, especially very early on in building these sorts of movements. And um, you're just not going to have a lot of information available to you uh, for a long time, for quite a while. You are effectively working day to day, and while you might be able to come up with some sort of grand strategy in your head around, I don't know, getting your neighborhood to hold a sort of popular assembly or some neighborhood meeting, or get all the tenants in your building together, or I don't know. If you're at a university, you can start a student union, like an actual student union, not the bullshit that they have at universities and high schools nowadays. A student's union, a student council, any of those sorts of things. You can kind of think of strategies for, like, I should do this, and then once, have A and B, and once A is done, I'll move on to C, and if B's not done, then we go to D, and once, D's completed, then we can finally go on to, plan E or whatever the fuck you decide to do. I'm being very general because all of these sorts of things depend on your specific instance. You have to figure that shit out. You have to be able to employ analysis in a way where you can come up with effective strategies for action and for organizing within your environment, if that makes sense. within your material conditions, as a Marxist would say. And of course, you have to develop strategies that are, again, molded by the resources and means that are available to you, once again, to call on what Moose said. So, to continue yeah, you have to fine tune it to your circumstances. Yeah. And that's why getting a small group of people together to kind of catalyze this sort of movement is especially important and effective at actually getting it going. Even if it's only two people. If you can get two dedicated people, meaning you and yourself, or you and one other person, me, myself, and Irene, great movie. But if you can get two people, yourself and one other person, who are dedicated militantly towards this sort of action, and again, I don't mean violent or um what would that be, destructive action. I just mean militant in your steadfast dedication to carrying out this sort of action. If you are committed to those uh to that action and those ideals, and you can find someone else who's equally or more dedicated to those principles and ideals and to actually getting shit done, that is going to make all the difference in your ability to actually get this ball rolling. So, to continue what McVeigh writes, it seems clear that the left in general has failed to do these things, which I would agree with. Beginning with Sharp's final bullet and working backward, there has been a serious deficit of strategic thinking in general, let alone grand strategy. Most of the left does not understand or accept the legitimacy of serious resistance, especially if it involves mobilizing political force outside the electoral system. Definitely have to agree with that one, The independent social groups and institutions of the left, from unions to sympathetic media, have withered, often with considerable assistance from the established left. And lastly, the left's, quote, determination, self-confidence, and resistance skills are seriously lacking, largely because of a refusal to fight and an insistence on forms of protest that have not historically been responsible for success. What we need, and what Sharp argues for, is a culture of resistance. What we have is a culture of defeat. And we're going to get into what a culture of defeat actually is in a little bit. But for any of you folks at home, call in, let us know what you think of that perspective. I'm actually talking, if you can hear me typing, I'm speaking with a couple of organizers right now who are currently in a little bit of a kerfuffle because, again, in Phoenix, there's a lot of presence of ICE, and there's a little bit of kerfuffle with ICE harassing homeless people. So I've been talking to them. Moose says, yeah, I agree, the mainstream left, though it may be generous to call the established liberals that, look down on extra electoral action. Yeah. And this atrophies the ability of people to organize and organize effectively at that. I completely agree, Moose. And the really interesting thing is we have radicals who are taking that moderate stance. They're taking the position of liberals when it comes to organization and action, which is just wild. It's wild that we've gotten so ineffective that we've abandoned like radical militancy altogether, it seems. And again, militancy, I'm not talking about like militant action in terms of like violence or destruction. I mean like really putting all the effort in to build extra electoral movements that are able to build supply chains and, you know, manage resources and all this sort of shit, right? We kind of have two sides where you get so radical, or not so radical, but rather, you know, you kind of move over into what has historically been kind of the individualist anarchist side, where they're just rejecting any sort of formal organizing, and they want everything to be done at like cookouts with your local anarchist clique, to like, you know, kind of the Voshian perspective of let's just fucking abandon all of this shit. You guys are LARPers, you know. Uh we need to figure out either how to fuck over the electoral system so much that we accelerate into people caring about electoralism again, which is wild, or, you know, electoralism good, we have to fight within the purview of electoralism so as to do reformism or some shit. Like, just ignoring intersectionality completely. And I think that's why, you know, a lot of people joke around with a lot of the mainstream, or not mainstream, but the kind of independent left in America these days is effectively like bourgeois socialist. Like they're completely Lassallean in their political analysis, right? And Marx writes about this because it fucked with them. And now people who invoke Marx are doing that very thing which he critiqued as being ineffective and the road to essentially the liberal capture of radicalism, if you get what I'm saying. I don't know if I'm using too much jargon right now. Moo says, theory has been divorced from praxis. They dream of some perfect candidate that will bring about their ideal government. This will never happen, not realistically speaking. And instead of having boots on the ground, they whine and do nothing. No, yeah, for some reason, sometimes it just doesn't show up on the actual screen of live chat, but I can see it. I have a version pulled up that isn't the top chat, but instead is the live chat. So I can see it. Don't worry. If I don't see something, that means I just scanned over it with my eyes, and you can remind me in the chat. So yeah, they're very there's a lot of problems with the current movement, and I feel like a lot of that comes out of a culture of defeat, which is why I think it's so important to actually go over this, and why I'm basically going to just read this verbatim as an excerpt while doing some sort of commentary over it and responding to any questions in chat, because I want to be able to share this with people and people be able to read this and see, you know, they're caught up in this very culture of defeat that is being described. So to continue with what McBay writes, people do not like to feel ineffective, powerless, or downtrodden. An old saying suggests that those who can't fix a bad situation, quote, will make a virtue of necessity. That is, if you can't change your situation materially, you can psychologically adjust by rationalizing or even glorifying the things you feel you can't change. So if I feel politically marginalized, maybe that's not because I'm not effectively reaching out to other people, but because but because all other people are irretrievably corrupted. In that case, it's good to be politically marginal, because that means I'm politically pure. And if we are unable to mobilize political force against those in power, maybe the problem isn't one of strategy or recruitment. Maybe it's because we shouldn't mobilize political force, and only by throwing ourselves entirely on the mercy of those in power will we finally transform their hearts. Michael Albert, in his insightful short book, The Trajectory of Change, argues, quote, today's activism, for want of revolutionary design and spirit, is often ill-informed, frequently lacks integrity, and virtually never incorporates the kind of logic, solidarity, and spirit that can sustain long-term involvement by suffering constituencies. Current movements are most often too narrow, too lacking in scope and in spiritual and moral appeal to attract wide support. Remarkably, they often celebrate their very weaknesses, their lack of vision, their lack of breadth, and their lack of anything resembling audacity and passion, as if these debits were virtues. Uh, and then McBay goes on to write, I believe that when a group of people are unable to effect change over a long period of time, they may develop a culture of defeat. They may make, quote, virtues out of dysfunctional habits. There are cultural tendencies common on the left that are part of a culture of defeat. What do we think of this? What do we think? Because I think, that kind of hits the nail on the head. That's basically exactly what I was talking about earlier. Um, though, again, not specifically with some of the situations that we're talking about in reference. Let me see. Who says, I agree that there may be some tendency to idealize one's inability to foment change as an indicator of political purity and as an excuse to rebuke outreach. It's what marks you, quote, not one of the elite. Yeah. I definitely see this more so with a lot of anti-electoralists. But I feel like a brand of this is exactly what leads to radical uh individuals resorting to, again, like electoralism because they're doomer on any other kind of action. So, yeah, I feel like he's kind of hitting the nail on the head. So, let's get into kind of a little bit further. So, one of the tendencies that create a culture of defeat is personal purity. So, unable to mobilize effectively to transform systems of power, activists focus on lifestyle changes, like clothing, diet, and consumerism. Resistance movement is hard, but it's easy to say, stop wearing leather, and if everyone just drinks fair trade organic coffee or hitchhikes instead of driving a car, the problem would be solved, right? A consumerist approach is also encouraged by marketers who want to profit from genuine urges for sustainability and justice by directing them into capitalist eco chic. Um, Maybe the purity is spiritual rather than material, and the objective is to empty one's heart of all hate while looking down one's nose at the vulgar people who would stain their souls with the messy business of protest and disruption. Or maybe it is a political purity, a more revolutionary than thou approach that dismisses anyone who would dirty their hands with anything less than immediate and complete, or completely hypothetical, transformation of everything. In any case, once personal purity becomes the end goal, social movements turn on themselves. Their day to day purpose is no longer to organize and fight power, but to police their comrades, to criticize and exclude those who are insufficiently pure. And then it goes on to reference the insights of Joe Freeman's feminist theory. Any thoughts on that? Do we have any ideas? I'm probably going to edit this later to cut out the dead space between actually reading. I might keep the full VOD up, but then have a separate, just I'm reading specifically the culture of defeat section of full spectrum resistance. Let's see here. Hey, Tragic. We are currently going over the culture of defeat section of Eric McBay's full spectrum resistance. So we just talked about personal purity and how that contributes to a culture of resistance, and we're going to move on to horizontal hostility in a minute. Right now, I'm just uh, talking to Moose about what he thinks about the personal purity aspect of a culture of defeat. Moose says, I think that groups like the DSA or the CPUSA, with their points of privilege and internal animosity, can conflate systemic change with something more interpersonal, as with lifestyleism. Yeah, I feel like that kind of hits the nail on the head. Though, for some reason, certain people, when I bring this up to them, they think me saying to not just do electoralism is somehow me doing some sort of personal purity testing of them. When instead of personal purity testing, I'm telling them, hey, that ineffective thing that you acknowledge is ineffective, and you should branch out to other things as well. Yeah, take a sip of water. Okay. So, to move on, horizontal hostility. Having failed to fight against those in power, people take out their anger and frustrations on each other, It's a lot easier to fight the person sitting next to you than someone in a distant House of Parliament or corporate headquarters. And if victory continues to elude them, it's because their would-be allies are reactionaries, or vanguardists, or dangerous anarchists and vandals. People who are willing to fight back often have more fiery and combative personalities, so such conflict is easy to provoke. The term, quote, horizontal hostility, was coined by black intersectionalist feminist and civil rights organizer Florence Kennedy. She called it, quote, misdirected anger that rightly should be focused on the external causes of oppression. Anne Hansen explained to me that this phenomenon is so destructive that intelligence communities, quote, like CSIS and the RCMP, don't have to spend 1 cent in our communities because people spend all their time attacking each other over the little things instead of talking about strategy. Michael Albert, writing about what happens to people who encounter a movement for the first time, asks, quote, does this person merge into a growing community of people, feel more secure and appreciated, feel a growing sense of personal growth and of contribution to something valuable, and enjoy a sense of accomplishment? Or does this person meet a lot of other people who continually question her motives and behavior, making her feel insecure and constantly criticized? All right, what do we think of that? And then I saw some people commenting on the last section as well. Tragic says, I'm an idiot, so I never have anything to contribute to this stuff. I don't think you're an idiot, but, this is kind of heady shit, so I understand if it's a little bit hard to parse and then come up with something to actually say about it. I know this is like the 3rd time I've read this section of this book, and I'm currently on my 2nd reading of the 1st volume. Moose says, there's a difference between saying you must do X or you'll have sinned and, quote, you should do X in addition to, or you'll have lost. Yeah. The former is deontological and concerns itself with adherence to principles, whereas the latter is strictly consequentialist. Yeah. I mean, I'm not too, well versed on consequentialism or deontology, but from what I have read, that seems to effectively be what's going on. From like an ethical framework point of view. What do we think about horizontal hostility as a concept in a culture of defeat? And where do you guys see that popping up in, I mean, to get straight up, in the communities that we are in, either community that you're in person or communities that you're in online, or that we're in online? How long have I been streaming? Oh, not that long. Just over half an hour. Tragic says, look, I went to public school. This is above my pay grade. I also went to public school. Checkmate. Just gotta read more books. Who says, people can occasionally direct a want for change in an institution towards a hostility to someone that they have imagined is a proponent of said institution. I definitely feel that, yeah. Either that or someone who they feel is taking a position that instead of combating or reforming that institution is effectively enabling it. Like, a lot of people make that criticism of anarchists who aren't necessarily super big into electoralism. obviously anti-electoralist anarchists are kind of taking that position, but specifically anarchists who take a position who uh, where they don't necessarily think we should put a shit ton of effort into electoral canvassing and energy and money into that sort of thing. A lot of more moderate and liberal minded people are going to see that as effectively giving up, um, when that's not actually what that is. Um, and so they'll kind of look to those individuals as being the reason why their actions, their ineffective actions, are ineffective. Think of liberals blaming American Muslims for not voting for Kamala. I feel like that's kind of a good example of horizontal hostility, where they have created strategies that come from the privileged position of not necessarily being involved in these genocides, whether, involved mentally, spiritually, or culturally, or physically involved in the Palestinian genocide. We're taking this privileged position saying, you have to vote for this person who will do nothing. And then when they won't, basically saying they're the reason the strategy failed, when the problem was you devised a strategy of attack that, instead of taking into account the positions of, all the people who would be there to support it, instead of doing that, you effectively created the strategy from the top down and told every person to instead align themselves with the philosophy of the strategy, which so many people aren't willing to do because they're so close to the hurt and the pain being caused, um, by these politicians. And that's one of the big problems with electoralism is, if you took a radical militant stance against the government, and again, I'm not saying violent, I'm not saying destructive. When I say militant, I just mean that you are dedicated in a way to action, to extra electoral action, and action outside of institutions, or at least mainstream institutions. Uh, that is what I mean by militancy. Basically going all in. Um, I feel like, if we did that, so many more communities and groups of people would be willing to join in. But because we're taking this approach that is interfacing with the system because it exists within the system, so many of the people being abused and exploited by the system aren't willing to participate. And so it would be a lot more effective if, instead of simply doing these electoralist campaigns, we created grassroots movements with organizations, federations, mutual aid organizations, direct action organizations that all come together to create effectively a significantly larger organization, a meta organization, which is effectively what a confederation is. If we did that, it would be significantly easier to convince all the members and the communities that exist within the what would that be, within the space that those groups exist in or around, using that as a means to promote maybe a specific candidate as some form of, I hate this shit, like I fucking hate it, but like harm reduction or whatever the fuck. Like, these groups are significantly more capable at mobilizing people than canvassing, right? And these groups can do canvassing, and they can do it for very cheap and with way less effort than it takes, electoral canvassing initiatives to do. You know what I'm saying? So Moose says people can occasionally, yeah, yeah, it's the anarchist or the Muslim that causes the liberal to lose the election, not the fact that the DNC can't platform a populist. It's such nonsense. Yeah. Yeah, they can't platform a populist, they can't platform a decolonialist, they can't platform someone who is explicitly against Islamophobia on like a very like guttural sense. Someone who is fervently and militantly against racism, right? So, they're not able to mobilize people because they're effectively saying you people are stupid, just follow my orders and everything will be all right, which is not how you mobilize people. That's how you lose, you know? Unless you're already in a position of power where you can force those people to do it. But in that case, those people aren't actually doing what like needs to be done to resist this shit. You are forcing them to. You have become something for them to resist. You've become a agent of the oppression that they're trying to get out of. Moose says, well, yeah, canvassing typically comes from the hand of the politician, so to speak, as opposed to an already established group that then goes on to maybe advocate for harm reduction. The latter is an extension of the community. Exactly. And again, harm reduction is the wrong term to be using in this instance. It's just escaping. So, it's about time we move on. We kind of covered horizontal hostility for a good bit. Let's go ahead and move on to loneliness and withdrawal. This is all, to be frank, very dreary stuff. It is no wonder that many people withdraw from radical communities that are unpleasant or unfulfilling, that they retreat from difficult political life into the relative calm or loneliness of private life. Loneliness in human communities, political or otherwise, is contagious. This isolation and withdrawal can be worsened by the paranoia about state surveillance and persecution. The state wants to encourage this paranoia so that radicals don't reach out to one another, and plenty of radicals are happy to play into this, rather than addressing actual issues of security and safety. Paranoia-inducing counterintelligence schemes are discussed in Chapter 9. People don't only withdraw into solitude. People need community to feel whole, and if they aren't getting that from resistance communities, then they'll find it by withdrawing from political engagement into apolitical groups that can meet their human needs, or by withdrawing into a social media simulation of community. Who says, plus, at the very least, if that candidate loses, that group won't dissolve like a witch in rain. Yeah, because they're entirely independent of that candidate. Yeah. Basically, grassroots electoral movements dissolve the second the electoral campaign ends. Maybe it kind of straggles on, or small groups from the movement kind of branch out to go and do other things. But that's effectively just you met friends doing an electoral campaign, right? So, it's the same thing with like a protest. Don't organize a huge protest, organize the community around a cultural, kind of like socially revolutionize your communities so that instead of organizing these protests in these ways, and obviously organizing protests can be good either way, but I'm just saying broadly, um you know it's way your movement is going to be way stronger and way more resilient if all of these things that have to do with electoralism and protesting and rioting and doing all these different things, instead of being the thing that you're doing, being the thing that you're organizing, being a action that a radical contingency that is what would that be? Like intimately organized and intimately knowledgeable with each other is doing, right? It's way easier to especially partake in more dangerous actions if there is an entire community willing to support those people, willing to put together court funds, willing to, you know, give them support when they're imprisoned, or um, is capable of self-defense during protests, right? We don't have Black Panthers anymore. We don't have, the best thing we have is certain groups of Antifa train with guns and are willing to basically hang out at protests to make sure Nazis don't do anything crazy, right? Like, or hang out outside of a drag queen show, right? Which I love drag queens and I love, protests and shit, but like we need effectively like an even more organized, even more militant version of Antifa, not to do its own action, but to defend people escalating their own actions within our communities, right? Tragic says, me isolated? Never. Just because I don't live in the city and have no friends or anywhere to go and am essentially stranded and isolated. Yeah. Who says, you want retention, and if it's just one big showing and never coming around again, you won't have much done. Direct action rests on the implication that there is a tangible block that will fight for what they want. Perennial demonstrations with little organization are of a markedly limited consequence. Yeah. Pretty much. Pretty much. And that's, that segues pretty well into symbolic actions. In a culture of defeat, people do not know what actions will be effective, or they feel that no actions will make any difference. If nothing makes a difference, there is no point in taking any risk. So people stick to polite protests, letter writing, or the like. Conversely, militants in a culture of defeat may carry out actions that are spectacular, but ultimately symbolic. That said, the difference between, quote, symbolic and, quote, direct action is not as important as decisive shaping and sustaining actions, explored in Chapter 11, Actions and Tactics. And I feel like this is something that is intricately important right now. It's so complex, but it's so fundamental to wrap our heads around in order to resist, this coming onslaught by the American aristocracy and oligarchy. And this also applies everywhere else. This is not localized in the US. If you're not in the US and you're watching this, you should also be doing this, because doing this before something like what's happening in the US happens in your country means that you might actually have the strength and the power to stop it from happening, right? You can stop it in its tracks if you have a large enough contingency. Even 10,000 people in a group like this, 10,000, which feels like so much, but if you really put in the effort, if you really find the most dedicated people in your communities and in your localities who are willing to commit themselves, or at least a good chunk of their time, to these things, 10,000 people can be achieved in a few years, right? You could achieve it in a year if there is that much of a social want for these sorts of organizations, right? So if you're not in the US, if you're in Canada, if you're, somewhere in Europe or some other English-speaking, English-knowing country, because why else are you reading? Why else are you listening to this? This is still integral for you to do. Gotta take a sip of water. Let me see how much of this there is. Okay. So I'm going to quickly go through vague goals and no strategies in a little bit. I just want to talk a little bit about symbolic actions. Ooh, Iron Law. Yeah. Might not necessarily cover the Iron Law of Involution, but it might actually be a good idea to cover that. And then later on, I can go over a culture of resistance on another stream. Though I'm afraid that might, consequentially happen way later than I want it to. Because I'm terrible at actually organizing these streams. So, does anyone have any ideas about symbolic actions? Any thoughts? Any feelies? Let's bring back the feelies, guys. We need more feelies. We have a culture of unfeeling. We need to feel more, guys. Feeling is an act of revolution. Or something. I don't know. I know love is. Loving is an act of revolution. And I mean it, obviously. Those words can be skewed, but I think you guys know what I mean when I say that. Though, not every watcher of this is going to have reference for what I mean. I'm going to give it a little bit longer for anyone who wants to say anything about symbolic actions, and then I'm going to go ahead and move on to vague goals and no strategy. Tragic says, honestly, our existence is a form of resistance, if you think about it. Yeah. Being open about your existence, especially if you're trans or queer or a minority, being loud and proud is a form of resistance. And, any minority group, obviously if you're like a Nazi minority group in a community, that's not resistance, that's oppression. But, if you're a more libertarian minority within a larger authoritarian community or group, that's an act of resistance as long as you're being out and open and, representing well. Any of that, advocating for more extra electoral action in electoral communities, that's an act of resistance. Though, again, you don't want to conflate acts of resistance against horizontal, conflate it with horizontal hostility. Don't start attacking your comrades when you should be attacking actual, oppressive structures and individuals. Moose says, I agree with the notion that if you're unable to consider in full depth the consequences of your actions, that it can be hard to decipher what makes symbolic action symbolic and direct action effectual. Moose says, now, we need to be kind to the national syndicalists. They haven't even had nap time yet. Yeah. Yeah, if only Wrestling with the News was in here. Our favorite Nazi. Nationalist syndicalist. By that. Look, nap time is important, especially if you're a syndicalist. Especially if you're a syndicalist. But yeah, I feel like not being able to conceive of the consequences of your actions, that very that is a huge impact on whether or not you're able to perceive the difference between symbolic and direct action. Like, so many people in the communities that I'm in and that you all are in as well, so many of those people see many of the symbolic actions of elected politicians as some sort of direct action, which is wild. Are the nationalist syndicalists not fascists? I might be out of it on my nomenclature. I can separate that strain from actual syndicalism, just as I separate National Socialism from socialism. No, nationalist syndicalists are fascists. I'm just calling Wrestling with the News a fascist and a Nazi. Yeah, 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 hilarious. Yeah, oldest trick in the book. Oldest trick in the book. If he watches this later on, he's gonna come at me. I know it. Let's see here. All right, it's time to do the big one. Vague goals and no strategy. Um, well, it's not actually a big one. There's just a lot following it that I want to cover as well. So, yeah, I'm gonna take a sip of water and then go ahead and read the last one. Vague goals and no strategy. Devising strategy is a complex and iterative process. To develop strategy, you try different things. You see what works and what doesn't, and then you adjust your approach based on what you've learned. But for that to work, you have to A, try different things in the first place, B, correctly identify what has been successful and what hasn't, and C, have enough success to learn what works. Without clear, concrete, short term goals to rally around, people with different political ideas can't find common ground. And if they can't fight together, they'll fight each other. Pretty cut and dry. It's basically what we were just talking about earlier when it comes to horizontal hostility and, liberals attacking anarchists and Muslims. And lifestylists attacking organizationalists, I guess. All right. I'll continue reading what McVeigh writes. Those are some of the main elements of a culture of defeat. The psychological results of this culture are loneliness, apathy, depression, and learned helplessness. This is precisely the psychological state that those in power want us to have, and that their counterintelligence programs and psychological operations are meant to evoke. See Chapter 9, Counterintelligence and Repression. Horizontal hostility worsens all these feelings. If you can't trust your allies to refrain from attacking you, then where can you find safe harbor? Where can you find a haven from which to organize and plan action? Unrestrained and unconstructive anger between allies and comrades is deeply demoralizing. But I believe that one of the strongest signs of a culture of defeat on the liberal left is the abandonment of anger. The mainstream left has a tremendous fear of anger. It is afraid to feel angry or to express anger at those in power. Somewhere along the way, many people began to put feeling anger and taking action in the same category as napalming a village or beating protesters. Anger is a totally appropriate and valid response to witnessing or experiencing injustice. To try and quash that legitimate feeling is not an act of moral superiority, but of helplessness. Those who are truly helpless will do what they must to cope. But let us not make a virtue of self-disempowerment. The refusal to feel anger or despair, uh, or many other appropriate feelings, is a refusal to confront the reality of our situation and the pervasiveness of global injustice. Obviously, taking out anger on our own friends or colleagues can be a destructive form of horizontal hostility. Uncontrollable and inappropriate anger can damage a movement and hamper action. But we can say the same about uncontrollable and inappropriate fear, sadness, cheeriness, anxiety, or any other emotion, even love. How many women have refused to leave violent domestic situations because they love or claim to be loved by their abusive partners? Black intellectual Laurent Binet Jr. wrote about the condemnation of anger in 1964. He argued, quote, "The harsh fact is that the choice for most Negroes is not between hating or loving, but between hating and hating, between hating themselves or hating their oppressors. You cannot deny people with basic emotions of rage, resentment, and yes, hate. Only slaves or saints or masochists love their oppressors. If you humiliate a man, if you degrade him, if you do this over and over for hundreds of years, he will either hate you or hate himself. Or perhaps he will hate those closest to him, his comrades. Horizontal hostility drives people apart. The fragmented movements of isolated people are not effective. For one, this fragmentation creates homogeneous, siloed groups. Combatants are grouped with other combatants, but too often lack the resources to reach out to community members and get the support they need. Moderate community organizers might have strong social connections and resources, but lack allies with a militant edge to undertake necessary risks and confrontations. Yeah, take another sip of water. These divisions are bad because resistance movements are most effective when they are diverse, when they have a heterogeneous mixture of different skills and backgrounds. This makes them robust and gives them the strategic capacity essential to success. See Chapter 12. I recommend all of you to read this. It does have some anti-anarchist positions. He himself is not an anarchist, and he seems to have a poor understanding of anarchist organizationalism. Uh, but pretty much every other part of the book is fantastic, and I highly recommend all of you to read it. Though, of course, critically, as anarchists. Who says, I don't know how hot I am about the hate rhetoric. Of course, I despise the fact that I live in the context of a system of global oppression and worker exploitation, but I am one to separate oppressive system from oppressor in isolation. Yeah, that's definitely a perspective. I'm planning to go over a whole, like, text that goes into the intricacies specifically of that argument of, like, whether or not to hate and whether or not to, like, the effectiveness of nonviolence and all that. I might actually write my own piece and make it its own, like, separate video essay, because there's a lot that Ark McBay talks about, and then what's his name? I always forget. Peter Gelderloos. That's the other one. Peter Gelderloos and then Ark McBay talk extensively about the, um, ideas behind whether or not to hate, the effectiveness of nonviolence, whether or not nonviolence is itself like an act of resistance, or if it's kind of like an act of, like, privileged, um, whatever. I don't plan to go too much into it, but I will say, like, anger is totally, like, totally reasonable. And also hate, like, you can hate a cop for doing his job because he should just not be a cop. Like, cops are constantly met with people critiquing police to their face, and they just ignore it. So Like, obviously, there are a lot of oppressors who are basically just caught up in an oppressive system. And so hating every single individual is kind of misplaced, but specifically hating the people at the helm or who are the swords of the oppressive system, I hold no critique for that other than, you know, don't think that going out of your way to attack those individuals is necessarily going to undermine the system to any, significant extent. Moose says, "Oh, do you plan to cover the Catholics workers movement?" I don't necessarily to cover the Catholic workers movement specifically, though if I write my own video essay, I do want to go over the workers movement. Um, but yeah, Moose says, "I think it's more so an issue of internal rationalization of oppressing others as a means to have access to basic necessities. Of course, I can distinguish this from leaders of industry and organization who reliably have access to luxury and well living." Yeah. But then there's things like, police unions going on strike so they can, like, kill black people, basically. We're not allowed to kill black people? Well, then I'm not doing my job, you know. But that's a whole different argument. All right, where was I? A culture of defeat is commonplace. What we need is a culture of resistance, where a culture of defeat insists on personal purity. We need to see integrity in action. Where we have horizontal hostility, we need solidarity. Where we have loneliness and withdrawal, we need community engagement. Where we have symbolic actions and vague goals, we need effective action and concrete objectives. And where we have emotional suppression, we need ways of directing legitimate feelings into world-changing work. One of the most important ways to overturn a culture of defeat is by winning, and movements that don't do that, they tend to turn inward. And then it talks about the iron law of involution, which is, uh, you know, we can. So here, I guess I'll ask you guys: do you want me to cover the iron law of involution, or do you want me to cover a culture of resistance? Do you want me to kind of add on to what we've been talking about, or start to talk about how we can contrast that and how to get past it? Tragic says they have a question, but they don't know if it's relevant to this. Yeah, go ahead. Throw it out. I, as an authoritarian, will decide whether or not it's relevant. All right. Looks like we have New saying we should just start to get past this. I'll go ahead and see if I can pull that up right now. There we go. Tragic says, how do we deal with the increasing number of people that refuse to accept ex-MAGA supporters into the left out of spite? I think it's mostly like a philosophical question, since I'm not seeing a lot of ex-MAGA supporters who are being kept out of the movement effectively. Though I feel like the biggest thing to do would just be to organize in a way where we can effectively integrate these people into our organizations and into our movements and rehabilitate them so that we can show everyone that these people aren't like essentially bad. Like, as like they're not ontologically bad people. I feel like, um, in a way, ex-MAGA people, like attacking ex-MAGA people, is a form of horizontal hostility because those people have become dejected from like their oppressive community, right? Ex-MAGA people are ex-cult members. And I would just kind of emphasize that to people, but I do think that um like taking the action to effectively integrate these people into the community is one of the most effective things that you could do to get people to understand that these people aren't evil. Tragic says, I see a lot of people online saying they won't accept them, but I don't know if they're liberals or like progressives being gatekeepy or whatever. It says, I will do my part to build the bridge of reconciliation on Tolstoyan's stones. Go for it, Moose. Godspeed, soldier. Yeah, I think a big thing is just like liberals are becoming reactionaries. That's what the whole dark woke thing is turning into. Um, it used to basically mean militant liberalism. Uh, is what dark woke was, and now dark woke is becoming militant like reactionism with like liberal aesthetics. So I think the way we fight this is the same way we fight reactionaries, which is doing shit. Like, if you don't want people to be kicked out of the community because they're ex-MAGA, you should. Yeah, dark woke sounds so contradictory to me. Yeah. I mean, what dark woke should be is like fighting Nazis, like on the ground and like beating the fuck out of them. And like that's what dark woke should be. Dark woke should be militant progressive. Like militant progressivism with like violent characteristics. That's my vision of dark woke. Whereas dark woke right now, like I said, is like reactionism with liberal aesthetics and like a progressive like nomenclature. Like dark woke would be going all in on, you know, integrating Antifa into our communities. And I mean like militant Antifa into our communities, supporting them, uh, creating the supply chains around militant resistance, all that sort of stuff. Like destructive resistance. That's what dark woke should be. But instead it's being co-opted by liberals who are turning to horizontal hostility towards everyone else. Like I see dark woke people being like, we have to abandon the Muslims. Right. Like that's just Islamophobia and racism. They're basically saying to be more progressive, we have to become reactionary. Which is just insane. Like that's just like capital C, capital D, culture of defeat. Yeah, there's no woke part of it. Like it's just progressive nomenclature to kind of disguise becoming a reactionary. But good luck convincing people of that. Like, they're starting to go in deep. They're starting to become very dogmatic about it. Dark woke sounds like a psyop. I don't think it's a psyop. I think, like, we're so fucking stupid and ineffective. This is just actually where we're at. Like it said earlier in the book, and tragic, I don't think you were here for that. But they Ark McBay was basically saying the government doesn't have to do anything in our communities because we're just constantly fighting each other. And that's like a huge part of a culture of defeat. And liberals used to kind of exist outside of the culture of defeat because their system was still in place. And now that it's gone, they're starting to develop like the worst aspects of a culture of defeat very quickly. Like the internet is kind of accelerating this shit. And so especially terminally online liberals, which are a lot of the people who exist within our communities, are starting to very quickly be like radicalized into like reactionism. Though I want to be very clear that doesn't mean that they're moving to like the far right. Like that's not what I mean by reactionism. I just mean they're taking on reactionary characteristics instead of progressive characteristics. Like they're replacing their like progressivism with reactionism. Though I would say like being racist and Islamophobic and anti-leftist, like a lot of dark woke people are doing right now, that is like laundering far right ideology. Yeah. Moo says, yeah, the internet insulates and allows people to go deeper and deeper to go to deeper and deeper extremes without a splash of cold water, so to speak. The DNC is trying to be petite MAGA. Yeah. Yep. Moose ate and left no crumbs. So now let's go into it. So as you can see, he is kind of finishing up talking about violence and non-violence and all that sort of shit. So this is coming off of the part that I want to go deeper into later on. But I just kind of want to talk about cultures of defeat and resistance so that there's an idea that people can get in their heads of, what the fuck is going on. How long have I been streaming now? Okay, I've been reading for like an hour 13. Okay, let's get this in, and then I will probably finish up. Cultures of resistance. Successful movements use diverse strategies and means of organizing, but movements that fight to win have something crucial in common. They all emerge from cultures of resistance. If a culture of defeat is like a sinkhole which devours optimism and action, a culture of resistance is fertile soil for defiance and successful campaigns. A culture of resistance gives a movement deep roots to nourish and sustain it. What is a culture of resistance? Cultures of resistance across history have common elements. Memory. In cultures of resistance, people know their history and remember their struggles. The most effective way for an occupier to quash resistance is to eliminate its memory. Once cultural amnesia sets in, an occupation feels like it has lasted forever. Resistance feels both pointless and unprecedented, but that amnesia can be reversed, even after a very long time. In a culture of resistance, struggles are treasured, even if they fall short of a victory. If a culture of resistance is the soil, even unsuccessful campaigns can enrich that soil, like compost. Once they have been integrated into it, and, like building soil, establishing a culture of resistance can be a long and slow process. What y'all think of that? Moose says, yeah, this cemented the death of the Frisian freedom. Freedom of the individual was maligned and degenerated into mere freedom from perceived, quote, foreign rulers. No longer were people accountable to officials they chose unilaterally. Yep. I think you're the expert we have on the Frisian like freedom movement. Not to say that you're an expert, you're just the one with the most expertise in our community. And I will say that I effectively see like this sort of stream, this sort of uh content that I'm creating as a community project. Uh the people both in the zone and in the other online communities that we exist in is effectively propping up my ability to do this sort of content and do like educational content like this. So anyone watching this in those communities, you are propping up my ability to do this sort of thing, however effective or ineffective it is. Moose says, of course, it's not necessarily something I've studied to the death. Yeah. All right. I'll go over living culture now. The memory of a culture of resistance is not a dusty archive or a stodgy museum exhibit behind glass. It is a living memory, a living culture. Resistance is celebrated and reenacted through a whole spectrum of cultural undertakings like plays, films, zines, books, newspapers, murals, photography, songs, and revival gatherings. Resistance becomes intertwined with the activities of daily life, from sports to food to clothing. Consider, for example, the resurgence of the sport of hurling in Ireland, the shift from tea to coffee in revolutionary America, and the role of homespun textiles and salt making in Indian independence. Oppositional culture. Cultures cultures of resistance are more than just alternative cultures. Cultures of resistance understand that the dominant culture is not only corrupt, but unjust, expansionist, and relentless. They do not abandon struggle to retreat into lonely isolation. They engage with the dominant culture and with those captured or enthralled by it. That doesn't mean that resistors don't need retreats, havens, or areas of redoubt. We do. Those places may be community centers, farms, or longhouses. But in an oppositional culture, those sanctuaries and autonomous zones are not places to hopelessly await an inevitable defeat. They are bases for resistors to rest and to recuperate, to strategize and to organize, and they are bases from which to launch offensives. Action and material gains. Although a culture of resistance can be expressed and in art, music, writing, and so on, its ultimate purpose is to give rise to political action. Progress and learning happen only through action. That doesn't mean every action is perfect. People make mistakes and learn from them. But only through action can resistance movements be forged, trained, and strengthened. Action keeps people together and helps to ward off horizontal hostility. As Sarah Falconer explained to me, practical work makes it easier to get past moments of disagreement. Quote, if people are counting on you, it grounds you. It's hard to get upset about little things. Solidarity. Solidarity is the bedrock of a culture of resistance. People understand that they have a common enemy and a common struggle, and that the success of that struggle depends on mutual support. They understand that no action is perfect, and that the best way to move forward with allies is not through ideological quibbling, but through mutual support, feedback, and constructive criticism. When people absolutely can't support each other for whatever reason, they at least avoid fighting each other, especially in public. They also understand that acrimonious internal battles can be even more destructive than external repression. Solidarity is the only way to keep a movement from being divided and conquered. Risk and sacrifice. Resistance requires personal sacrifice from those involved. Sometimes this is easy and immediately rewarding. I enjoy making food for an event or spending time planning an action with my comrades, but sometimes sacrifice is difficult and frightening. Sometimes we risk our freedom, our bodies, our lives. This need not be a reckless risk. We will not be effective if we seek martyrdom for the sake of martyrdom. But to be effective requires that we set aside our short term personal needs and throw our energies and our lives into greater projects of freedom and survival. Moral and material support for frontline activists. Not everyone is able or willing to take the greatest personal risks. Not everyone will blockade a pipeline or take over a city council meeting. That direct action is the job of only a small percentage of people at any given time. The job of the majority of people in a culture of resistance is to support those few. They need support morally through vocal support for militancy and advocacy for resistance. They also need material support through food, fundraising, childcare, prisoner support, and all the rest. A wide base of material support is needed to win any conflict. Communities and community building. Healthy, just, sustainable communities are one ultimate goal of successful resistance. They are also a basic human need. Without community, resistance is lonely, difficult, and unlikely to succeed. Communities are the basis of a living culture, of solidarity, and of nearly everything a culture of resistance needs. And the strong ties that develop in a strong community are what enable people to take real risks for the greater good. See Chapter 4, Recruitment and Training. What do y'all think so far? What are y'all's thoughts? I think most of these things are pretty, self-explanatory and, imminently apparent. But I know to a lot of people they aren't. So, is any of this groundbreaking or especially interesting or controversial? Moose says, I agree that we shouldn't seek martyrdom for the sake of martyrdom, and that risk taking of extreme proportion may only be needed from a small percentage of a resistant society. It all feels very fairly intuitive to me, but it's nice to have a concrete frame of reference. Yeah, that's why I was thinking when I first read through this, it's quite intuitive, but having it written down helps you to organize your thoughts. Tragic says, this is one of those streams where I'll need to rewatch a few times because my ADHD is so bad. Yeah, yeah. No, I'm currently on my second read through of this book. And this is my fourth time reading through these particular sections. I read through right before this, and then I read through it to reread it again a while back, and then my initial reading. Yeah, I feel like this is pretty important stuff, while simultaneously being, again, pretty intuitive. Who says it's important to reread, especially at different points in life, to examine the same concepts from a different vantage point, so to speak. I think, I agree. Yeah. I think that's pretty important. Let's see how much of this is left. Okay. I think I'm going to try and get through the rest of this in one stroke, and then we can talk about it. Conscious movement building. Movements need a culture of resistance, but effective movements do not simply appear without effort once a community of resistance is established. Communities must organize. Cultures of resistance must think critically and strategically about how to build effective and vibrant movements. That there is a reciprocal relationship between resistance movements and cultures of resistance. Each builds and strengthens the other. Parallel institutions. As they become better organized, cultures of resistance provide for their own people. Labor historian David Thompson says, quote, unions began as self-help initiatives, providing their own pensions, sickness, and health benefits, before they were ever able to extract those concessions from employers. Once a culture of resistance becomes a revolutionary movement, it builds institutions that can facilitate more just and equitable society. The United States and Irish and many others had revolutionary courts. The Black Panther Party had its survival programs for food, education, and healthcare. Revolutionary movements around the world have had fully developed logistical networks and parallel institutions. Sometimes, a culture of resistance can revive or strengthen institutions that already exist, as is still the case for some indigenous cultures. Sometimes, a culture's institutions have been so destroyed, forgotten, or hopelessly corrupted that they must be created anew. Subsistence and community sufficiency. For city dwellers in an industrial age, it is easy to forget that successful resistance movements throughout history have been materially self-sufficient. Free communities grew, gathered, hunted, and fished their own foods. They relied on, quote, the commons. They made their own houses, and, as discussed in the chapter on logistics, they often equipped themselves with their own weapons, communications equipment, medical services, and so on. Indeed, the freedom to be self-sufficient on their people's land was often the primary reason for struggle. Occupiers always try to separate resistance movements from the land and herd the people into controlled settlements, whether Indian reservations in the occupied Americas, the Jewish ghettos in occupied Europe, or the quote strategic hamlets in Vietnam. Community sufficiency is especially important in a time of economic and industrial decline. No resistance movement will be able to succeed in the coming decades without rebuilding or strengthening both its ties to the land and its capacity for self-reliance. All of these things are needed in a culture of resistance. All of these things are needed to build movements that win. But there is more than that. A successful movement must engage as many people as possible, using a wide variety of effective tactics. It must use, as I'll argue in the next chapter, a full spectrum of resistance. What do y'all think of that last half? Tragic, you have to come up with one thing to say about it. That's your homework. And by homework, and since you're already home, that means you have to do it right now. It's due in the next 5 minutes. Moo says, I agree that self-sufficiency is important in organizing, as to prevent being forced to make concessions to states. Yeah. I know a lot of people kind of talk about that as like prepperism or like primitivism, but if you see self-sufficiency, again, not on the individual level, but on like a like cultural and social level, if you see self-sufficiency as like primitivism, don't know what to tell you, man. Like, that's kind of step one of being able to resist. Like, if primitivism is being self-sufficient in terms of feeding your people and clothing them and all that, uh based primitivism 1, liberalism 0, but it's not. So like, I feel like a lot of this just comes from like urbanites hating rural people, like also just not wanting to do work, which, like, yeah, same, but you know, you kind of have to if you want to live, especially when you're doing a resistance movement to be able to live. If they're gonna kill you, yeah, you kind of have to do the uh things to live. Sorry to break it to y'all. Yeah, not to admonish primitivism. Primitivism isn't like, a lot of people just kind of strawman primitivism because they think of like eco-fascists a lot of the time, or they think of um like anarcho-primitivists that just take it way too far, who think like medicine is a system of oppression when it's just a tool that can be not oppressive. I think it's very similar to like the lifestyleism thing. Like, you just kind of lump everything into the system of oppression. Same thing with like anti-civ people. Like, they just define civilization as the bad things in society, when like civilization is just what we call society. Like, you know I feel like a lot of anti-civ anarcho um anarcho primitivists kind of come from the anarcho not individualist anarcho what is it? Not pessimism, starts with an N. Nihilism, anarcho nihilism movement, which is just like a bunch of like angsty teenagers who hate everything. Like, yeah. So, that's kind of my perspective on it, is a lot of the more extreme people when it comes to primitivism or degrowth or anti-civ are kind of following that same ideological current as anarcho-nihilists and as, the more, you know, not idealist, but just like, uh, ideologically incomprehensible individualists, where, like, their arguments are just them redefining everything and making a huge click out of it. Like, a lot of those ideologies are just redefining everything and then taking up the same positions as other people. But I know people make that same argument about anarchists. Of like, oh, you guys just want like a state, but XYZ. So that might just be my own misunderstanding, but from my own reading of primitivism, it's basically just degrowth. Like, it's just, what if we focused on degrowth while keeping like everyone healthy and happy? Like, how do we just not destroy the planet? That's basically primitivism. Plus some like weird idealization of like the primitive characteristics of indigenous people, despite the fact that indigenous people weren't primitivists nor primitive, and they didn't see their technological inadequacy as like a virtue until like way after colonialization, after their cultures had been like destroyed, and they kind of had a idealized perspective of the past, and they conflated their like past conditions with the Western idea of like primitive society. So I think fundamentally, like a lot of primitivism is in essence derived from kind of like an idealized view of the past through the lens of like the privileged like European cultures that colonized places. Like, I'm pretty sure indigenous people uh are pretty down with like figuring out how to manufacture insulin. Don't think, because like I've talked to some primitivists who are like anti-insulin manufacturing. So it's just like, I don't think I don't think you necessarily know what's going on. I think you've kind of backed yourself into a weird position of definitions. Yeah, and anti-insulin. Yeah. Again, I've only talked to a couple of people like that. Most primitivists I talk to, like the overwhelming majority, are just very focused on degrowth and like usually deep ecology. Um, whereas like social ecology is more in tune with like eco-anarchism and green anarchism and like communalism. But yeah, Tragic says, I know some anarchists are all for like DIY bathtub chemistry, and that seems kind of like a dangerous path to take. I mean, yeah. Um Obviously, I feel like that's mostly because we don't have the infrastructure to do our own like high grade synthesis synthesis. So I think like if we're able to I feel like that's less primitivism and more so needing to do DIY bathtub chemistry out of necessity. I'm personally pro bathtub estrogen insofar as that is the only thing you can do. Because I feel like estrogen is like for trans people, especially, it is effectively a miracle drug to, like, you know, cure their uh often very, very like detrimental depressive symptoms from body dysmorphia and the such. So I think, you know, if we were able to construct resistance communities and movements to the extent where we could start constructing the infrastructure for high grade syntheses of certain substances that are highly medicinal and healing, I feel like that would be one of the greatest wins we could possibly do. And if we're able to defend that, if we're able to make lab grade estrogen to give to queer people, if we're able to, get doctors to do gender affirming surgery as like mutual aid, that is kind of one of the clearest like wins that we could achieve, especially as trans people are more and more oppressed in our communities. Who says, well, the extent of infrastructure afforded to status society is a direct product of its incentive that crushes workers without relent and demands constant growth. Anarchism must rebuke this incentive. And that may necessarily mean that there are certain heights of infrastructure we cannot reach naturally. Maybe, in some respects, this is a necessary trade-off. Of course, we don't have to start from scratch. Yeah. I mean, like, I feel like we'd still be able to do, like, space travel under anarchism. Like, or not under anarchism, but, like, in an anarchist society. But there are certain things, like, let me think, like just destroying the land to mine gold. Yeah, that's, like, not something you can do. Like, you just can't do that. I'm sorry. And if, like, a bunch of shit relies specifically on that instead of, like, recycling gold, you don't get those things. Or we have to figure out a way to do it that doesn't destroy the environment and the world. Same thing if it's, like, lithium batteries. Sorry, man. You gotta come up with something else, or you gotta figure out how to recycle lithium batteries. Tragic says, yeah, we might be in that situation soon too, and that terrifies me. I just started estrogen in October. I'm scared DIY estrogen might be the only hope of a lot of us. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to tell you to go out and do DIY estrogen or look up how to do it and save all of the things that you would need to do to synthesize your own estrogen in your bathtub safely before the government starts cracking down on people trying to research that sort of thing. But if I were to do that, you know, if I did think that that was really important, uh, you know, I wouldn't say it because that's illegal. Moose says state infrastructure doesn't evaporate, but as time goes on, it will start to reflect our own incentives. Yeah, that on top of the fact that we can start to, through prefiguration, create like alternative infrastructure that is capable of similar things. And we can kind of take the technology and infrastructure from, um, you know, the state and from capitalists to effectively keep us from needing to start from scratch. But yeah, I think that's most of what I have to say. Um, Real quick, Tragic says, I've seen scammers selling fake estrogen supplements on Amazon. I've heard a couple of people were discovered to be tied to fart. far right groups with the intent to hurt trans people. Yeah, never buy estrogen online. Just never do that. I don't care if it's like a dark web market or anything like that. Just don't do it. Don't do it. The best. No, you're fine. This is actually a great conversation and fits in with like cultures of resistance and alternative infrastructure and stuff like that. But yeah, don't buy estrogen online or illegally, and don't organize communities around manufacturing estrogen to support trans people, and don't use the Tor browser to research how to manufacture estrogen and then save it locally on your computer as like an offline archive on how to synthesize estrogen. Don't do that. But when I say like don't buy estrogen online, I mean like actually don't do that. Like they are poisoning you. Like that's just a far right group trying to poison you. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the stream. I hope we got something useful out of all of this. I'd love to do this again soon, and yeah, if you guys want me to do more streams like this to cover more texts, to kind of host a forum for discussion, not debate, but like if anybody wants to come on and we can have a discussion about certain things, go right ahead, reach out to me. I have some contacts in the description of this video, and I'll be adding more context to it probably after stream. So yeah, thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I hope you enjoyed the reading. I love you all, and